want to stick with Peter Navarro for a second, because in the past he's also made some pretty bold statements. He's said that China has deliberately sent the virus to the U.S. to kill Americans. He said, and this was his word, that the China weaponized, that's the word he used, weaponized the virus. And this is a direct quote from him. They hid the virus. They sent hundreds of thousands of Chinese nationals over here to seed and spread the virus before we knew. I understand you're no fan of China and China can be nefarious, but have you seen any direct evidence, anything that, any intelligence that would suggest that China deliberately weaponized this virus to kill Americans and to send it to the United States?
No. What I have seen is evidence that, like most totalitarian regimes, they covered it up. They have a system of government in which you're not encouraged to report bad news, very similar to Chernobyl in that sense. And so local officials sort of covered it up, and then the Chinese covered it up. I have seen evidence that they, despite knowing that this virus would spread, they bullied countries around the world not to implement travel bans, not to prevent the Chinese citizens from traveling abroad, even if they could have the infection with them. These are all things they did do deliberately. But the notion that they designed it in the laboratory for the purposes of hurting the United States, if they did, whoever did that should be fired, because it's done tremendous damage to China's international reputation and has imposed significant economic costs on them. But again, there's a lot we don't know about what the Chinese did here, because it's not, frankly, the most transparent system of government in the world. And we'll learn more in the months and years to come. But I think I haven't, perhaps Mr. Navarro or others have evidence that I haven't seen, but I certainly, believe me, if I had seen it, I'd be one of the loudest voices out there talking about it that way.
Let's move to school reopening, because I think that's something that a lot of parents, it's an issue you're dealing with. You have school-age children yourself. How do you view where we are right now? I think everyone agrees that we want to see the schools open, kids to be able to learn. There are a lot of good things that happen when schools are open and kids are able to be in there, from getting fed properly, child abuse gets detected and seen earlier in the households. We're all agreeing. I don't think that's an argument. I think the question is, can we do it safely? So that's my question. Can we do it safely?
Yeah. It can be done safely. And of course, it depends where you are. The conditions are different. There are counties in Florida, more than half our counties, that could probably open up schools in August and do so without the concerns we have here in South Florida. To me, that decision is the same as all these others. There's a cost and there's a benefit. There are real substantial costs to not opening schools. The second point I would make is, if anyone who doesn't want to go back to work, or any student whose parents don't want to send them to school, should be given an option not to go back when you do reopen. The third is, we have places we can go to learn about some of the best practices here. For example, daycare centers and nurseries, most have not even closed throughout the pandemic. They've been open. We haven't seen outbreaks in nurseries and daycare centers across America. And so there's something to be learned by how they did it. Obviously, it's a different setting, but nonetheless, a very similar one. Other countries have opened up schools as well. We also need to understand, before we cancel the next 6 months, that we're going to be in hopefully a very different place 3 months from now, if we have those new therapeutics, if testing, you can begin to do it at home, as we're on the verge of being able to make that available to people. If you can do pool testing that allows you to test large numbers of people with less tests, if you ultimately have a vaccine, that's an option that will be available, that will give us more options down the road. So ultimately, you have to take all of this into account in making these decisions. So I think there are best practices that should be put in place, and you should put them in place before you open. I also think we should work hard to reopen, because the costs of not reopening are extraordinary. And that is particularly true for working families who have to be at work if they want to be, provide for themselves, and have no place to take their kids at 8 or 9 o'clock, 7 o'clock in the morning before they go to work. They're going to end up taking them somewhere that may be far less safe for them, and ultimately for the people carrying them in these homes where some lady takes care of all the kids on the same block. That's certainly not going to have any of the measures in place that schools would.
Are you planning on sending your kids into brick and mortar school buildings coming up this fall?
Yes. And again, we don't have anyone in our home that has an underlying health condition. And that I would be. Now, if I had one of my kids had such a condition, or I did, or my wife did, or we had an in-law living with us that did, or what have you, that may be a different consideration. But the answer to that question is yes, but that's particular to me. Now, if there's a child out there who has a sibling that has cystic fibrosis, or is a recipient of a transplant, or what have you, that might be a different consideration, right? So That's why that option needs to exist for people to make that decision. But our goal should be not just say we want schools reopened. You can't say the goal is to open schools under perfect conditions. At some point, we have to figure out what is an appropriate level of risk mitigation. What is a low enough level of risk that it tips the balance towards reopening because of the benefits the school provide, and understanding it isn't going to be school the way we traditionally think of it. It's going to look dramatically different for some time to come. But that's certainly better than the learning losses that we're seeing on some of this online learning that simply, especially for younger kids, is not a way. You're going to have kids continue to fall behind. It's going to be very hard for them to catch up.
Was the president right to commute Roger Stone's sentence?
Well, look, he was convicted. I have no reason to believe that he shouldn't have been convicted. I think that the question of whether the sentence that was imposed on him, because he didn't pardon him, he just commuted a sentence. And so I would say at the end of the day, look, I probably, if I were president, wouldn't have done it. But that said, this guy's, Roger Stone's not a violent threat to society. He's in the 70s. We're releasing people from prisons, including people convicted of violent crimes because of the COVID outbreak and so forth. So it isn't, at the end of the day, the biggest problem facing America. I'm generally not a fan of the commutation of sentences and interfering in the judicial process. I wouldn't have done it, but I don't think this is sort of the biggest problem facing the country either. And I understand why politically it gets a lot of attention, and it's not an illegitimate issue to ask about. But at the end of the day, if you commute the sentence of someone who isn't probably going to do this again, it isn't certainly going to kill anybody. At a time in which we are releasing people from federal prisons and state prisons, for that matter, who are violent or have issues of violence in the past because of overpopulation and threat of COVID. I don't think at the end of the day it rises to the level of something that I need to spend a lot of time being outraged over.